Okay, we're just about ready to go here. Another minute or so, it'll be 6 o'clock. Let's get. Okay, we'll start. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. So today I'm going to talk about Saññā, perception, as continuing the sequence of the five aggregates. Saññā is a mental factor, and it always operates in close association with consciousness. We will be having a talk on Vijnana in 2 weeks, so I have to anticipate it a little bit here to say, Vijnana or consciousness operating through the senses receives data through the senses in a raw form. So it's said, for example, that eye consciousness doesn't see a tree or a house or a car, it sees color and shape. And this raw information is then processed by Saññā, perception. And it's perception which recognizes the diverse objects that we experience with the senses. This happens very, very quickly. So it's extremely difficult in a practical sense to observe the difference between consciousness and perception. It may be a little easier to see with sound. Sometimes we can hear a sound and not recognize it immediately, and then very quickly identify it as a bird or a car or whatever the sound might be. But there's a definite difference between consciousness and perception. Perception is the processing of the information. Consciousness is just aware of raw data. And it's important to recognize that perception has inherent in it a creative aspect. You can see this in many kinds of optical illusions. There's a common optical illusion where there's a repeated pattern and maybe lines and dots. And at one point in this pattern, there's a dot missing. And unless you're staring directly at that point, if you're looking anywhere else in the diagram, your perception will fill in that dot and it'll look complete. There's a number of optical illusions like this. Well, perception has this creative aspect. It tries to make sense of the data that's received from the senses. Generally, if everything is in order, our perception of the external world is reasonably accurate, certainly accurate enough for practical purposes. But we can see easily that it's not flawless. There are many instances where perception messes up in attempting to parse the data. The old texts mention the classic case of mistaking a rope for a snake. One's walking on a trail in the half light, and there's a piece of rope on the trail, and you see it out of the corner of your eye and become startled and are quite sure it's a snake. And the perception act can actually fill in the details and make it look quite realistic until you examine it carefully. Oh, no, that's just a piece of rope. And we can have these kind of experiences all the time. And perception tries to present us with an accurate picture, but it's not without its difficulties. There are times when perception goes further wide of the mark, and we can see the creative aspect coming to the fore. A very good example I often cite explaining this is the way if you're relaxed and you're observing clouds, and you can see faces and shapes and animals in the clouds, and they can become quite detailed and realistic. This is an example of perception being somewhat let off the leash. You're giving it unconsciously or implicitly permission to play around with the data, make something out of this. And it does so, and it can create quite detailed images. This can happen with other things too, like looking at flames or random patterns. It's the principle behind doing an ink blot test, the Rorschach test. Is that people perceive shapes and things in the ink blots. And when we dream at night, the same process is working, but perception doesn't have sense data to work with. It's just working with fragments of imagination and memory, and it's basically making up whole worlds that can be quite realistic and quite detailed. Well, this is perception that's operating quite freely. So one of the important implications of all this, from a kind of philosophical view, is that we never actually experience the outside world directly. What we are living in is a simulation created by our own mind through the medium of perception. Perception creates a simulation, and it's limited in a number of ways. Is first of all, it's only working with the data that comes in through the senses, and our senses are limited. We have the sense of sight is probably the most important sense for understanding the world for a human being. We rely on sight a lot. Sight only perceives a narrow bandwidth of electromagnetism that we call visible light. Well, all the time, there's many other frequencies of electromagnetism that are in space around us that we have no direct knowledge of, because our vision only can see in that narrow bandwidth. There are insects that can see a wider bandwidth and can perceive colors. Bees and wasps, for example, they can perceive colors that we can't even imagine. They've done tests that show that bees can experience two separate colors above violet in what we call the ultraviolet, the non-visible EM, but it's visible for them. It's the same with all our other senses. Sound, we only perceive a range of audio frequencies, and we know that the principle behind having a dog whistle is inaudible to humans, but dogs can hear at a higher pitch than humans can. Dogs can also smell a lot better than humans. Their sense of smell is much more refined. They can distinguish many other molecules than our noses can. So first of all, we only have these kind of narrow apertures from which we receive information from the outer universe, and we construct our simulation based on that limited range of data. And perception does as best as it can with the information given and creates a world that we live in. This world is a pretty decent, at least from the practical point of view, from manipulating objects in the world and getting around in the world. It's functional, but we shouldn't be fooled into thinking it's actual reality. We never can directly touch or know the outer reality. It has to be limited, filtered through the first of all the senses and then perception. This is kind of important to bear in mind, lest we fall into a kind of naive realism. The fallacy that what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell is all there is. This is a kind of a default position of unreflective humans that just take what is given to them. But it's not to say that the world is an illusion either. There are different philosophical takes or positions within Buddhist history as to the actual nature of the outer universe. But I think the dominant view within Theravada is that the outer universe is a reality, but we can never directly know it. So it's kind of a reality, but we can never directly know it. So it's kind of a moot point. It's no point. It's no benefit to us to try and know it beyond what we can know. And what we do know is our own mind. And it's the only thing that we know directly is our own mind. Everything else is a reflection, is an image that our mind is constructing of the outside world based on this limited set of signals. Perception is also, I would say, educable. It can be refined. One can learn to distinguish more tastes or more colors, etc. And the way, for example, the way someone looking at a field, an empty lot full of weeds, will be different for someone who is a trained botanist. Their perception will be much more refined in seeing different species and variations within the species and peculiar individual plants, whereas the average person would just see a field full of weeds and not really perceive much beyond that. Their mind isn't habituated to parsing those details. So perception taking a hold of the object, and we've already discussed the khandha of feeling, and I mentioned in that talk that vedana or feeling only occurs directly with two senses: the sense of touch and the mind sense. And this is how perception plays into this. Is that with the sense of touch, it's pretty direct. You put your hand on a hot stove, it hurts, painful sensation. You feel a cool breeze on a hot day, it's pleasant sensation. And this is directly input from the body. But for the other senses for a sight or a sound, a taste or a smell. First of all, it's taken up by perception, and whether it's experienced as pleasant or unpleasant is based on that perception, and the perception can change over time, and it will be different between different individuals. So some people like certain kinds of food and other people don't, and the taste, the raw information should be the same if they have, if they both have normal taste receptors on the tongue, that the sense data arriving will be the same, but then perception perceives it differently, and then feeling arises after that as pleasant or unpleasant. Now you will notice that in the Satipatthana Sutta, it deals with 4 bases of mindfulness, and these correspond more or less to 4 of the 5 aggregates. And the one that's left out is perception. Perception is not considered as one of the Satipatthanas. And I think the reason for this is it's very difficult to, if not impossible, to separate perception and observe it as a separate phenomena, because it operates so quickly upon consciousness. So it really subjectively feels like we're seeing an apple sitting on the table, whereas what we're seeing with the eye consciousness is only round and red, and then perception sees the apple, but that happens immediately. It's so intimately bound up with the process of consciousness that it's not practical or useful object of meditative direct observation. Although, as I mentioned before, it can occasionally, if a meditator is very quick and sharp with their noticing, they can separate with the sense of sound. One would have to be very quick to separate it with the sense of sight, but with the sense of sound, all the ear hears is pitch and volume. And then perception determines that to be the sound of a bird or the sound of a car backfiring or whatever it might be. And sometimes with sound, you can notice that very quick gap in there where the mind is processing the raw information. There is a phenomena where the distinction between consciousness and perception can become evident with sight. It's something that can occasionally occur naturally in this kind of half awake state when you wake up. It can occur if you're in a strange place. You're traveling, say, and you're in a motel room, and you wake up and it's half light. It's not fully light yet, and the object, and you're relaxed. You're not in any way feeling troubled. You're quite relaxed and easy. You open your eyes and you see objects in the room, but you don't. All you see is shapes. You don't see this as a nightstand or a lamp or a chair. There's just odd shapes, and it's very quick. Maybe less than a second, or maybe at most a second. Then the mind will determine those shapes to be specific objects. So that's something that can happen. That we can see that gap between consciousness of a visual form and perception of a discrete object. Perception, of course, can be impaired in a number of ways. Certain drugs, for example, will confuse and impair perception. Certain mental conditions are primarily dysfunctions of perception, so it can be skewed from its normal course. But in a healthy, normal conditions and waking state, perception is operating very quickly and with quite a high degree of accuracy. So I'll stop there. That's about all I have to say about perception, and see if any questions come up. Just put any questions you might have into the chat as usual. Okay, first question. Sometimes it feels like I'm seeing the world for the first time. It feels alien and new and timeless. Is this the result of perception failing or breaking? Is this normal from practice or wrong practice? No, that's quite good. If you're seeing that, you have this kind of seeing things new. There's then the perception can be more direct, because this is something maybe I've neglected to mention, is the perception can become habitual, and we can fall into habits with perception as with anything else, and this can sometimes lead to false perception. But if you're seeing things brand new, the perception can be quite sharp. Could we say perception is a layer of learned memory that we acquire? Yeah, that's definitely a part of perception. It's trained by experience, by memory. Are things like loba, moha, dosa just perceptions? If not, what aggregates are they? Loba, moha, dosa are the root defilements: greed, hatred, and delusion, and they would be classed as sankharas. They're not classed within perception. Is not dreaming at night a prerequisite for enlightened being? Yeah, this came up before in a different context, whether arhants dream or not. And I don't have a definitive answer for that. I don't know if there is an answer to that, whether they dream or not. I don't see dreaming as such as being a defilement, so it could be possible, but there's also an element of delusion in dreaming. It may be that an arahant only dreams lucid dreams. I think this is an open question. I don't think there's a definitive answer to it. What occurs to me when reading Sutta Nipata and Udana, then reflecting and meditating, that even experience of the Nibbana itself shouldn't be taken for granted and grasped. So, in a sense, letting go and not taking anything up is the true meaning of Vimutti. Yes. Yeah. The enlightened mind finds no footing. It's not dependent on anything. So radical relinquishment is really the nature of the enlightened mind. Could it be true that the true outer reality is Nibbana, since we're trying to shut off things that make this experience of samsara? I kind of see where you're going with that, but I'm not really in agreement. I think samsara is also real. It might be real in a different sense. And I think that maybe there would be some schools of Buddhism over time that would take that position that you're stating. Nagarjuna says, as the figments of dream dissolve upon waking, so the confusion of samsara fades away in enlightenment. Does this match the Theravada understanding of destroying moha? Yeah, I would say so. There is a dreamlike quality to being deluded, to living in confusion, and becoming enlightened is often called waking up. So I think it's a very close analogy. Is perception of nimitta a precondition, necessary precondition for entering jhana state? Depends what you mean by a nimitta. This is a big topic. If one is reading the Visuddhimagga or modern writers who are basically following the Visuddhimagga framework, one would think so, that a visual nimitta always occurs before jhana. But there are other texts. I'm thinking of the Vimuttimagga, of the same vintage as the Visuddhimagga, but from a slightly different position, that dealing with mindfulness of breathing, it treats the visual nimitta as something that only occurs occasionally, but the normal true nimitta for mindfulness of breathing is a tactile sensation at the nose. And what happens is that the sense of breathing, initially, the sense of motion of the air back and forth is very predominant, but that gradually stabilizes until the meditator feels just a light pressure and the sense of movement is in the background. And that's a very subtle tactile nimitta. I think from my observation of people that that there's a minority of people that can do very well with the visual nimitta, but most people it becomes a hindrance, that they're unable to stabilize the nimitta, and they fall back and forth between the breath and the nimitta, and it kind of stalls their meditation. So in my opinion, the best advice, if you get a visual nimitta arise when you're doing breath meditation, is to try and stabilize it. And then if you do, you can take that as the object, and then you're not really doing breath meditation anymore. But if you have a stable nimitta, that can carry you through. But if you can't stabilize it, if it keeps coming and going or changing color, changing shape, then forget about it. It's just a distraction. Last week you talked about two pieces of enlightenment, one that comes instantaneous and the after section. What advice do you have for someone who has gone through the first part? I would, yeah. There is this phenomena, I think, of kind of an halfway or an aborted breakthrough, and you can rest assured that if you have, begun the process, you will finish it. You just keep doing the meditation, and just keep trying to be peaceful and stable and observe the process of the mind. Why would an arhat sleep? Because biologically human beings need sleep. I don't think there's much of a problem there. Even the Buddha slept, but if we have we have one text that talks about how the Buddha spent the night, and it seems like he only slept for like 2 hours, but he did sleep. I think there's a biological need as long as you have a human form. In a famous sutta, the Buddha refers perception to a mirage. This metaphor seems like perception is mind-made, image constructed that is not really there. Any comment, Ajahn? Yes, yeah, it is. The analogy used by the Buddha for perception is a mirage in the desert. It is something created by the mind, but it's as you say, it's not really there. It's in a sense an illusion, but um, in normal circumstances, if you're sane and your senses are in good order, and your perception will be not random, but a uh, close simulation of the outside world. And we know this because we are able to move around and manipulate objects in the world. So our simulation is quite accurate generally, although I cited a number of ways in which it can go wrong. What is the role of perception in mental disorders like schizophrenia, derealization, etc.? And do you think they are fixed or given order to by? Do you think they can be fixed or given order to by mindfulness and right view? I don't think first of all, I'll say not really sure what derealization is, but schizophrenia is definitely has an aspect of disordered perception. That's one of the ways. That's probably the principal way in which it manifests. I don't think it can be fixed by meditation. It seems like, and I'm to some degree basing this on. I'm trying to remember the author's name. It will come to me. There's a author who wrote about transpersonal psychology, and he dealt with various mental disorders, and they occur at different levels. And schizophrenia is at a very base level. It's largely somatic. There's some disorder, chemical disorder in the nervous system, in the brain, which so it's at the level of body. So that disturbs the perception, which is mental. But as long as we're human and we have a body, our mind and body interact with each other. So I don't think those very serious disorders can be treated by mindfulness. The Buddha's path was meant for those with little dust in their eyes. Next question. It's my understanding Mahasi Sayadaw noting methods seeks to separate perception and consciousness. If so, do you think that it's ever possible with enough practice? It's theoretically possible. It's very difficult, and as I explained in the talk, it seems to be more approachable with sound than with sight. It's extremely difficult to separate them with sight. But if your meditation is sharp enough, you should be able to separate them with sound. And if you're really, really good, you can separate them with sight too, because it is theoretically possible, but it's extremely difficult. And I think that's why it's left out of the Satipatthana Sutta. Once again, I've lost my place in the chat here. Okay, I found it. I read Mahayana idea of Buddha mind comes from Sarvastivada idea of eternal Dhammas. It also is a Bodhisattva ideal. Cause Mahasamgika rejected both ideas and more. Some say Mahayana actually originate from Sarvastivada, that sect that became way too liberal thoughts. I think there's a historical link. A Sangha, who was one of the early and his brother Vasubandhu. Vasubandhu wrote the Abhidharmakosha, which is a critical text of the Sarvastivada school, and then later he converted to Mahayana. He's kind of a living bridge between the two. So he came out of the Sarvastivada school. On the other hand, Sarvastivada is considered one of the branches of the Sthaviravada. At the second council, the first split of Buddhism was into two, Mahasamgikas and the Sthaviravadas. And it was the Mahasamgikas that are generally considered by historians to have evolved into Mahayana. This is all really very obscure historically. We don't really have a good, can't really trace the lineage of the early Mahayana schools back through directly to the pre-Mahayana in most cases. Do I understand correctly that in human form we are never truly able to understand the cosmos, but when understanding one's mind truly, I can draw conclusions that are true to the cosmos? Yes, I would say that's an accurate understanding. That's why the Buddha always emphasized internal examination and discouraged speculations about things like the size of the universe. For one thing, that doesn't help you in any way, and the other thing is you can never really know it. All you could know is your own mind. All you could ever truly know directly, immediately. As the Awakened One said, being human is a rare experience, a species among millions of other species, and this is just the Earth, not other counting other planets, galaxies, etc. But which one do you think is more rare than the other? A human to be reborn as a human, or a human reborn as an insect? Well, it is said that in Samyutta Nikaya talks about how it's much more common for beings. It's much more common and easier for beings to reborn into a lower state. It's like the difficulty of maintaining a human state is high. So I don't know the particular. I can't say the particular case of being an insect, but it's very easy to fall into a lower realm. It's very difficult to be born human or higher. And it's kind of a general rule that the lower realms are more populated than the higher realms. I recently contemplated the Four Noble Truths, and the following thought arose. Is it correct to say that in order to cultivate compassion towards others, it's important to remember that when experiencing someone is acting hurtful, this also arises as a consequence of suffering? Therefore, I should focus on the being experienced on dukkha